Acts, the 9th chapter. I'd like to spend a little bit of time this morning on a very precious disciple. The context of this actually takes us back a couple of chapters when that we find Philip a bit before, when that he was preaching away and there was seemed in Samaria to be such a wonderful gathering. So many turned out and many were converted. Among them was a man, Simon Magus. He was a sorcerer. It seemed like a great thing. Little did the church know the great danger there was in this man being baptized and coming into the church. And what seemed to be an ardent professor. Little did they understand what lay before them and the potential that was there. And you remember how that Peter came and how that God gave him the discernment when Simon asked, he said if he could buy the gifts of the Spirit so he could also bestow the Spirit upon others. And in but a moment, how that God spared the church. Not just the church in Samaria, but how many souls there were. He was a man that had before presented himself as a great one of God. And now as a professed believer in Christ, now to let this pride so exude from him once again to gather followers. How the Lord put a hedge around those people in Samaria that day. All of this was going on, a great deliverance. And there was another man around the same period of time in Jerusalem, a man named Saul. And you remember how that Saul had such an inveterate hatred of the things of Christ that he went and he sued in Jerusalem to the Sanhedrin to get documents to be able to go to Damascus and to apprehend all of those who would be Christians and to bring them back in chains to imprisonment, to suffering, and even to death for their faith. And on the road, do you remember what happened? How that the glory of the Lord came and surrounded him. Saul that was breathing vengeance against God. And the word that came in the midst of the light that enveloped him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Why do you kick against the pricks? And then you remember how the story went on, how that he was told to go to a certain place, and as he went, and he was blind, and how God appeared to another prophet and said, go, lay hands upon the man. He's a chosen vessel. And I will send this man that had been an inveterate enemy of the gospel. I will raise him up and send him forth as a messenger of grace abounding. And he will go before kings, and he will go to the nations, and he will speak to them. And he still speaks to us. Peter had gone down into a place called Lydda. And there was, in all the simplicity, there was a man, Aeneas, that had been sick and laid upon his bed 8 years. 8 years he laid upon his bed. And I wonder, just in passing, well, it doesn't say much beyond the fact that Peter had gone down and no doubt sat with him and looked upon him, the man paralyzed as he lay upon his bed, but a believer, 8 years a believer. I wonder what it would have been like for others to have gathered around the bed of Aeneas 8 years as he lay there. I wonder what he talked about. Do you think that as he lay there was, oh, woe is me, my aches, my pains, all the things that I used to do when I had all of my strength, but now look at what's happened to me. And to thrive on sympathy and to have an old story that he would tell again and again of what sad things he encountered. Or was he the kind of a man? Was he, and I suspect he was he the one that could say, I love to tell the story. Come sit with me. Come whoever you are. Come. And here upon my bed of sickness and my paralysis, I can tell you what great things that God has done. I can do this. Those are rare individuals. But would to God there were more Christians that were like that. I remember once reading an account of a minister rather, that was visiting. He was new, and he was visiting some of the people in his parish. And he was going to make a house call at a certain place, and he went and knocked on the door, and he heard a voice from inside, very weak and trembling, to come. He opened the door, and he couldn't believe what he saw. There was an old man sitting in a chair, tied to the chair, with, as it were, a harness under his chin, holding his head up. And there he was, with his arms scarce able to move them because of the excruciating pain that he was in and the weakness that he was in. And there he sat as the door was opened. And that's what the minister first saw. And no doubt the minister, his heart sank with pity for the man. But then he noticed something about the man. He had a Bible opened in his lap. And the minister came in and began to talk to him. And the minister wrote afterwards about the encounter. He says, I had never met a man under nearly any circumstances, but a man under these circumstances that radiated such joy in the Lord. He said, I came to administer comfort to him. I did. In whatever state that he was. But he said, the minister said, but as I sat there and I listened to him tell about Christ, I listened to him tell about how precious his walk had been. I listened to him tell of goodness and mercy. I listened and I listened. He said, I never encountered anything like this. I would imagine that Aeneas was a man, no doubt, very much like that. And would to God that as Christians we would bear a better testimony also of the goodness of the Lord. Oh, we talk about it. But let some circumstance come, and how quickly our hearts, we pray, will be tuned to sing his praise. Now go to the lower notes where we moan and we groan and we talk about how dark and how hard everything is. As though we had no good shepherd. As though we could never say of truth concerning our lives, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And as we read in the 16th Psalm what David said, the lines have fallen unto me in pleasant places. Is that the way it is with you? Regardless of your circumstances, regardless of relationships, regardless of finances, all the difficulties in health, can we say, because the Lord is good, truly the lines have fallen unto me in pleasant places. And that's what the old man, all tied in his chair, with his neck held up as it were with a noose, and with his Bible in his hand, that's what he would say. The lines have fallen unto me in pleasant places. I have this, and I have Christ also. Is that the way it is with you? All of that being said, the story then turns down to a seaport town called Joppa. Peter had gone, he was at Lydda, and it begins in verse 36, and I'd like to spend a little time here. Beginning with verse 36, the saga opens. Now there was at Joppa a certain disciple named Tabitha, which by interpretation is called Dorcas. And this certain woman that was a disciple, was full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. Now I think the thing that's interesting here is the name, first of all. It speaks of her, first of all, as being a disciple. She wasn't a mere churchgoer. She didn't just go to church, sit in the pew, sing the song, stand up and go. She was a disciple. She was more than just a follower of Christ. She was one that it seems, and we see as this unfolds, that she was more than just a mere professor of something, more than just an adherent to a mere creed. That there was something that had so transpired in this woman's life that rendered her so almost exceptional, that note is taken of her. And though dead, yet in these scriptures it speaks. And the name, I think, is particularly wonderful, Tabitha, translated Dorcas, a disciple, a woman. The name means, as it were, a deer, a gazelle. And among the Hebrews, the gazelle was like a metaphor for beauty, for beauty. It didn't have anything necessarily to do with the physical beauty, but with a deeper spiritual beauty. We hear that phrase used again and again in the Song of Solomon as the bridegroom refers to the bride, and he refers to her as that. That there was something more than just appearance, something more than just the way she dressed, something more than just her manners, something vastly more than just her education. And there was something about this disciple that the very name rendered. She was a beautiful disciple. A beautiful disciple. Wouldn't it be a wonderful thing if that could be written of us? Not just disciples, but something that is so changed within that we are beautiful. In God's sight and in the relationships with others around us, as we'll see in a little bit what this was. It goes on to say that she was in this city port of Joppa. And it says in verse 37, and it came to pass in those days that she, the beautiful disciple, so loved and so loving, the beautiful disciple, she was sick. But not only was she sick, Tabitha, the gazelle, the beautiful disciple, she died. And the result of that was what we read here, that as she had died, they came and they washed, they laid her body, and they prepared her in an upper chamber. Folks would come through and see one more time. And one more time pass by her. One more time look upon that lifeless form. And one more time, no, many more times, they would always remember her. What she left behind. What she had left behind. Verse 38 tells us, and because Lydda was so near to Joppa, and Peter and the disciples were there in that place, having spent time there after the healing of Aeneas, that there were two of the men, no doubt from the little church where the Dorcas was in attendance. And they sent for Peter to come. And they were very urgent about it. And they begged him, come without delay. I doubt that there was any prospect that they had in their mind that anything could be done for poor Dorcas. She was dead. But all of the grief and the sorrow that surrounded, as it went on, when he came into the room, it says, when he was going up the stairs into this upper room where the body of Dorcas was laid, he could hear coming from that room such tears, such heavings of heart, such sorrow. And as he opened the door and he looked, there were all of these women. And they were widows. And they were weeping. And as they were weeping, they saw Peter. And they came to him and clutching in their hands. What were they clutching in their hands as they came? Weeping to him. They were the clothes, and they were the garments that she had made. Notice this, while she was with him, what she had done. It reflects back on that she was full of good works and alms deeds. She did. Now, there are many professed Christians that are very thoughtful, and they do wish well, don't you know? They do. But that's as far as it ever goes. It never translates into something that is done. That's what we find with Dorcas, and then move on, that she was not only had a great heart and a deep sympathy for the needs that were around, but she had a faith, as Paul writes, a faith that worked by love. It wasn't idle. It wasn't just wishful thinking. It wasn't just somebody else will take care of it. Somebody else will do well. No doubt these old women or these widows, these that were poor and so destitute, no doubt many of them had no one to care for them. No one. It was a small church. And those small churches didn't have many means. They didn't have much. But this little church had Dorcas. And that made all the difference. Made all the difference. What she did, I think, is very precious. You stop to think. When Peter came into that upper room, and there was her body, there were the others that were weeping and holding the clothes as it were memorials, not just of things to wear, but the testimonies of her love. Stitch by stitch by stitch by stitch. We don't know a great deal about Dorcas. We can only surmise some things. In all likelihood, she was just like all of the church was in those days. You remember what Paul wrote about to the church of Corinth? He told them, and I would imagine the church of Joppa could have been said the same thing of, behold your calling, brethren. You at Corinth, you at Joppa, and perhaps even us here at Westminster. That there are not many wise after the flesh, and there are not many mighty, and there are not many noble that are called, although there are some who like to come into a church and like to parade as though they were. These weren't like that. He said, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world, that he might put to shame them that are wise. And God chose the weak things of the world, that he might put to shame the things that are strong. And the base things of the world, and the things that are despised, did God choose. And that seems to be a picture of what the early church in most of its gatherings was like. And in all likelihood, and we have no reason to think otherwise, that was what Dorcas was like. We know only about her works that she was a seamstress. She didn't have a great name. She wasn't known for talent and for art. She wasn't known for her rhetoric. She was a seamstress. And in those days, women of wealth and position would never sew their own things. The indication seems to be from that calling that she was probably very, very poor. And it could have been that she was a slave. And yet she became a Christian. She became a Christian. And now, when she looked and she saw the needs that were everywhere around her, it wasn't just, oh, those poor old widows, or those that are struggling and have nothing. Or I see them weeping, broken-hearted. They have none to care for them. They have no food. Their clothes are all in tatters and rent. And Lord, what can I do? If she was so poor, as in all likelihood it seems she probably was, she would look, but it wasn't, there's nothing I can do. She was, you see, a beautiful disciple. She was a beautiful disciple. And she looked around. And no doubt she asked, Lord, what can I do? What can I do? I have nothing. I have no wealth. I have no education. I have nothing but you. And what shall I do? How wonderful it is. Lord, here I am. Here's my needle. Here's my thread. There is the need. They're my people. They're yours. Let me, Lord, let me with my needle and with my thread, if this is all that I can do, let me serve you in even the least of your people. Let me do this. And how wonderfully the Lord blessed her. She was a beautiful disciple. And she wasn't one of these kind of professors. It's only incidental. Oh, well, here's a little something for you, and throw it their way, and they're gone. The indication she was full of these. Not with a lot of money, not with a lot of talent, not with a lot, but with a heart where it found something, that it could minister to Christ. And do you remember the old saying that we have so often used? He serves Christ best who serves him in the least of his people. And isn't that what Jesus said? When I was sick, you didn't stand out and give me a grand oration of a sermon. You didn't come to me all dressed up as though making a fashion statement. You came down into the prison where that I was, and there you knelt beside me. There you talked with me. There you bound up my poor broken heart. And when I was hungry, you didn't come and just wish me well, but you saw the need, and you saw how helpless and hopeless I seemed to be. And you came, and that poor soul you fed. And the one that had his clothes was all in tatters, he said, and naked, and you clothed. That's in a way what Dorcas had done. But to see a need, but more than to see it, to seize the opportunity that lies before you, and to have affixed to that what Jesus said. These people, it had become so much a way of life with them, as evidently with Dorcas, that when Jesus said, when I was sick, when I was hungry, when I was naked, when I was in prison, they said, when? It was so much a part of them. You see, they were beautiful disciples. This is what love does. This is the fruit of the Spirit that makes a beautiful disciple. But when, Lord, did we ever minister to you? When Jesus said, you've done it to one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it to me. Well, where do I go to find them, Lord? Where do I go to find them? Oh, I know what I'll do. I know what I'll do. They take up an offering at church, don't you see, this Sunday to help take care of the needy in the church. Well, by proxy, I'll just drop my money in there, and I've done my part. I'm on my way. We call that proxy. How many ministries are there that function basically by proxy from individuals within the pews that need only to look around them and see the family of God, many times in states of spiritual and financial and emotional and relational destitution? And we say, well, here, now you church, you take care of it. Dorcas wasn't like that. I think that's one of the things that stands out so much in this. Dorcas was not a person who cared for others by proxy. That's one of the banes of the church today. Proxy is not love. Proxy is duty. Love is when you see the individual and you go and you know the need. And even if all that you have is only a thread and a needle, your life and your work will make a difference. And that's what Jesus said. And would have said to Dorcas, Dorcas, look around you. All you see is these poor old widows. They are so poor and so helpless and so sad and so needy. She said, I have only my needle and thread. Dorcas, if you have done it to one of the least of these, you have done it to me. You have done it to me. She did that. And not enough to assuage your conscience. Well, I'd help that one. My deed is done. Now don't you see, church, what a good Christian I am? Don't you see? Why? I've made donations. I've helped out. See, Dorcas wasn't like that, which I think is maybe one of the reasons why that this beautiful disciple, her name is engraven in the book of life, for us to read and to weep that we see so many and we're not like this ourselves. Now, it wasn't enough when the plate was passed at church on some Sunday morning and the few coins of the poor were tossed in. It was more than that. Love can never be content at a distance. I think that she experienced what every Christian should experience within that little church at Joppa where she was. A blessed tie that bound her heart to these people within her little church with Christian love. That's a very different thing. Now, we have the place in Scripture where it says, we are to do good unto all men. We are. But it doesn't end there. There's a focus and there is a centrality. We are, wherever we can, do good to all men. But it says, but especially to the household of faith. Now, the household of faith, many times we think of as it's the vast universal church. And every day we can get envelope upon envelope of requests from this ministry and that ministry and yet another ministry. And we feel that we're doing God's service by stuffing the envelope and sending it back. But what about the brethren? What about the family that is here? Not just out there, but what about the family that's here? What about Westminster? Are there those that have needs here also that could benefit perhaps a bit more than paying overhead to big ministries, expensive things? That's what the early church was. Now, the early church did take up collections. We understand that. To help. But it wasn't to build big ministries. It wasn't to build big names and to get notoriety. It wasn't to have expensive materials. It wasn't to live a fairly luxurious lifestyle. What was the money collected for? It was to care for the poor and for the needy. That was largely what it was collected for. And to take care of those like Paul that when there was nothing left, he would sow tents so he could continue preaching the gospel. But there was no fanfare. There were no grandiose ministries. There was nothing like that. But the world was turned upside down. And I think the world was turned upside down because there were beautiful disciples, a disciple of the gospel, like Dorcas. She would be remembered. She would be remembered. I think it's such a beautiful thing when we think of the church and the complexion of the church, as the Bible suggests. It's not like this today. You seldom see this. You know, we're so bent on aggrandizement, a good presentation. I had a fellow stop by yesterday, actually. I'll just stop for a moment and tell you a bit of a story. He stopped by yesterday, and I was working on my sermon out by the other side near the woods, and saw the car pull in. So he got out, he's walking around the church, and I thought, well, I'll go up and meet him. And maybe we can have a talk together. So I went up and I greeted him, and he turned around and he says, well, God bless you. And my heart, we have a brother. We have a brother. He says, God bless you. And then as the conversation proceeded, he began on this note. I'm retired. And then he told me all his credentials. He's a retired drug rehab fellow. He's a retired this, he's a retired that. I got all his credentials. And he was on his way at that time to conduct some kind of a meeting for singing in churches. And I thought, well, that thought of having fellowship, it just took wings. It's gone. He's concerned about talking about himself and what he is, what he does. So I asked, would you like to come and see the church? He said, sure, I'd love to come and see the church. So he came in, he said, oh, you've got a baby grand piano. He says, I have one too. He said, mind if I play it? I said, sure, go right ahead. So he sat down with all of the art and the finesse. Why, those little keyboards, that just tinkled to Amazing Grace as he sang Amazing Grace, as though he was in as though he was in an opera hall. He was singing it, playing it, and you could see he was totally enwrapped in the song. And he got up. He says it has a wonderful history to it. And I thought, well, now we have some common ground. He says he was a slave man, but he gave it all up to become a minister. That was it. So I began to talk to him. I said, but it was much more than that. I said, the song was about Amazing Grace, how Christ had become everything to him. He was but a poor sinner and nothing at all. And the hymn reflected the experience of the Christian, that Christ is everything. Grace, great grace abounding. And you ever try to tell something in such a way, the more that you tell it, the more precious it becomes, and the more you want it to be held, and you long for a response back to it? But when all was said and done, after talking about the spiritual meaning of Amazing Grace, I got another litany of all of his excellencies. It was like someone said, spaghetti hitting a wall and it doesn't stick, it just slides down. Is that the way it is with us? Are there those that long to tell you the old story and there's nothing? You have your credentials, you've got your good life, you've got the business that you did, you've got your present possessions, you have this. And before he left, he gave me his thing, and he says, if you want special music, he says, here's my phone number, give me a call, and I'll come back and I'll have special music for you. And I told him, no, we don't do that. He said, what do you mean? I said, all right, we don't have a talent show. So we had right here today, we don't even have a pianist today. I said, we don't do that. I said, we gather together, we take our faith very, very seriously. And when our people sing, there's no praise group leading them out. There's no drums. There's nothing. We sing as unto the Lord, as brethren. We have met to worship. We have met to worship. It didn't catch at all. How can you do that? He would have come today, and he would have been astonished that, brethren, we have come, and we have come to worship. And we are worshiping. without the talent, without this. Dorcas wasn't like that. The early church wasn't like that. This is a picture, I think, a cosmos of what the church was like and what the disciples in the church, many of them were like. They were beautiful. They were poor sinners saved by grace. But they were the ones that loved to tell the old story. And I can only begin to imagine. Take yourself, if you were poor and desperately needy, and you hear that the Tabitha, Dorcas, she'll help you. She can't do much, but she'll sew the tear in your coat. And you go and you sit with her, and she's just stitching. I don't think so. I think that this beautiful disciple, if she had the opportunity, as she sat and took her time in the mending, you would hear her telling what wonderful things the Lord had done. I think that she would love to tell the old story again and again and again. And I would imagine that those that went to her from her little church, as they went in their need, not ashamed they were needy, not looked down on, but she would take them and they would sit, and she loved them. She'd help them. That they loved to hear her tell the old story too. Now, what about us? What about us? Is our religion only proxy religion? We've done our part, but as far as what she did, I wonder if it could be said of us and of our church that here are those that are his disciples, and they are beautiful. They are beautiful. I think that's very important, and I hope we won't forget it as the time goes on. The church is not the building. It's not the grounds. There are those who feel they're doing the Lord's work by just taking care of the grounds or just taking care of the building. And nothing more. Nothing more. Thankfully, this little account is put here. We talked about this in Sunday school. Let me just toss this out to you. How old do you think she was? How old do you think that Dorcas was? There's a wonderful silence. It doesn't tell us. It doesn't tell us. And I think the wonderful reason why it doesn't tell us, if Dorcas was herself an old widow, then the younger people would say that's for old people. Was she herself a widow? Maybe. Was she a young woman, perhaps like Ruth and Naomi? Naomi was old, and Naomi had lost everything. She was a widow too. And yet Ruth would come to her and she would say to her, when she could have gone back to all her enjoyments and all the people she knew and all the programs and things she was involved in, she would leave everything. Naomi, where you go, I will go. And your people will be my people. And she went on like this, where you go. Was she just going to tag along? You read more about her, that she would go out and in the heat of the day and she would gather wheat that had been left behind by the gatherers. She worked and she worked hard and she brought it home with a gladness in her little bucket, and she would present it to Naomi. The two of them would sit together and they would eat. But you notice it wasn't done by proxy. She did it. Maybe Dorcas was a widow. Maybe she was like Ruth. Or maybe she was a youth. Can you imagine, and so rare today, to see a young professed Christian that you can say, by their deeds and their heart. This is a beautiful disciple. This youth radiates such love towards God and such care to others. Not just talking about it, not just knowing what to do, and that I should do it, but I have too many things I'm involved in. You see, I have a lot of other stuff to do. Where in the scale and the balance of the things that make young people today beautiful disciples? We talk about it, but in so many cases, our situation is very similar in our homes to what Jesus found in the home of Martha and Mary. We keep the young people so busy, hither, thither, and yon about this religious program, this place to go, that place to go. You'll be better if you go there. You'll be more adjusted if you go here. And if you do this, and if you do that, and you do something else. Mary, what are you doing? I am a disciple, you see, and I'm sitting at the feet of Jesus. I think the message could come many times, perhaps clearly and sharply, pointedly, to many of us as Christian adults, and parents. Be careful that you're not pushing your agendas of success by involving young people in things to such a degree that they become like Marthas. They become like Marthas. And they no longer have time even to understand the one thing that is needful. The one thing that is needful. That was a survey that was done not very long ago on that subject. They found that in the evangelical churches, I think we mentioned this back a bit ago, but I'll say it again. They found that in the evangelical churches, most of the parents that they talked with were more concerned about keeping their young people in programs so they become acclimated to doing things, knowing how to do things, so that later on they'll have a better standard of living, they'll have better lives, they'll have a better marriage. They'll have all of this that's accumulated from the busyness. And what they found was when they really pressed the issue, that very few evangelical parents were that particularly concerned about the spiritual well-being of their children and what they were doing to their children by trying to make their children Marthas. It takes a dreadful toll. And is that one of the reasons why that the youth of this generation are leaving the churches in great numbers? The churches are being purged from young people that have been raised on this program orientation, but have never been taught what it is to be a beautiful disciple and given time and example to be that. They're too much like the world. Dorcas wasn't like that. And I wonder, if Dorcas had a bit of money, she could have spent it on 1,000 different things. And our youth, many times, is the same thing. Oh, you've got this place to go. You've got that place to go. You've got this to do, that to do, that to do. And so we spend a tremendous amount building this up. Well, if we look around to the poor and to the needy, wouldn't it be a beautiful thing if a young person were to say, you know, Mom, you know, Dad, yeah, it would be fun to do that. But you know something? There are those within the church that don't have much. I don't need this. And I don't want it. I neither need it nor do I want it. But what I want is to be a Christian. I want to be like Dorcas. I want a heart. It's not all about me and what I can get and what you're going to give me and how much it's going to cost. He must increase. Mom, Dad, teach me. You teach me what it is to be a Christian. You teach me by your example and by the focus and the emphasis in your life of what you're trying to impose on me. You teach me what it is to be a lovely disciple. Teach me. Do you think that Martha was, when she heard what Jesus said about that? Martha, Martha, you're encumbered about by many things. Our young people are encumbered about by many things. And a lot of it is dumped on us, on them. Mary has chosen the better part. Is that what we're teaching our young people? The better part. Seek first the kingdom of God. Become a true disciple. More than just a follower. But like it says here, a beautiful disciple that was full of good works and alms deeds, which she did. That's why her name is written here. What she did, what she did. And I'd like to make mention Hebrews, the 10th chapter, verse 6, along the same line. We may think there's nothing in it, so we don't do it. Hebrews 10, verse 6 says this, for God is not unjust. God is not unjust, that he should forget, notice this, God is not unjust, that he should forget your work. Are you doing any work? We had a song we were going to sing. Have I done my best for the Master? Have I, in the past, looking back over my life as a professed Christian, have I ever truly or consistently done my best for the Master? And as I sit here in this church upon this Lord's Day, am I presently doing my best for the Master? And as far as the future is concerned, have I a resolution that from this day forth, you will find me doing my best for the Master? Or will it be like it's always been? But you notice what it says again, referring to this passage in Hebrews. For God is not unjust that he should forget your work that he's appointed to you and given you gifts and graces and opportunities to fulfill those works in the household and among the household of faith. For God is not unjust that he should forget your work. And notice this, and the love which ye have shown in his name, and that you have ministered. You have ministered. And not only have you ministered, but look at this, and do minister. To who? To the saints, God's people. God's people. What is your work? What is it? Is there love that motivates you in the name of Christ? Not just to wish well, but in such a way, as it says here, to minister. And not only to minister a time and then I'm done, but as it says here, and do continuing. So long as there is need, so long as there is opportunity. Lord, here am I. I may not have much, Dorcas would say. All, Lord, I've got is my little needle and my thread. But Lord, this is my work. You have shown me. And now, Lord, let me take my thread and my needle. I wish I had so much more. But right now it's all I've got. But Lord, let me minister. Let me minister. Let me minister. But very quickly, the story doesn't end there. It goes on. They had brought Peter. Peter comes, and we pick up the story. He's come into the room, and the tears, the brokenheartedness for one that was so loved, that had loved them in turn. And it says that in verse 40, Peter turns around and no doubt very gently, he asks them all to leave. I would imagine as they left that room going out the door, each one of them in tears, perhaps never to see her again, looked over their shoulders perhaps for one last time and wept and wept and wept as they left, that indelibly her features would remain in their memories. Peter asked them to leave. And then it says that he kneeled down. For what end? The beautiful disciple was dead. She was dead. He kneeled down. And the Spirit of God moved in his heart to understand she is dead. But only for just a little season. She will be raised again. And no doubt Peter might have thought, yes, in the day of the resurrection it will be wonderful, like Mary with the resurrection of Lazarus. But he has a heavenly impulse and he turns. It says to the body. He turned to the body and he said, Tabitha, Tabitha, you that are dead, Tabitha, arise. And he looked, and she opened her eyes, and she saw Peter. And then the one that had been sick and so weak, unto death, sat up. But that's not the end of the story. I think the end of the story implies some beautiful things about Dorcas and the people. So when she sat up, I can't begin to imagine what Peter must have thought, or what she thought. But in that moment, it says he gave her his hand. He gave her his hand. She's laying there. He gives her the hand. He lifts her up. She stands upon her feet, just as though she had never been sick a day in her life. Oh, the vibrancy, all that was there before of the beautiful disciple. Again. But it doesn't end there. And he leads her to the door. Now you have to picture this. The door had been closed. He sent them all away, all outside. He prayed. Dorcas is raised. He comes to the door, he opens the door, he looks, and there they are, still, their hearts heaving with sorrow and tears as they clutch the clothes and they remember. And then he stands aside. And there is Tabitha. I wonder what it was like at that moment. I don't imagine they said, wow, we weren't expecting that. I would imagine what it was when they saw the one that they had loved standing now again before them. That she rushed towards them, and they rushed towards her. And what heavenly, joyful embracings and tears, no longer of sorrow and sadness, but tears of joy and of thanksgiving. Tabitha, you've come back. She says, yes. But Tabitha, what will you do now that you've come back? We're not told, but I think we can surmise it from this beautiful disciple. I can only imagine she embraced this one and that one and another one. Mary, you have a rip in your sleeve. Come, Let me fix it. And Martha, Martha, you need something different, something new. Come, let me fix it for you. God didn't give her a mansion. God didn't give her excelling talents and articulation. God gave her what she had before. A life of a disciple that loved, that cared. And one that when she went back to her work, no doubt it was the same, with her little needle, her little thread, stitch by stitch by stitch, and telling the old, old story. Paul said the same thing when he's writing to the Philippians. For me to live is Christ. It is. Is it for you? For me to live is Christ. And he says to die is gain. And to depart and be with Christ, he says, is far, far better. But if the Lord should choose that I must remain here a little longer, as he did with Dorcas, I'm content. Because you see, while I am with you a little longer, I can continue to minister to you a little longer. Dorcas did that. What about us? What about us? To the older saints, what of you? After you leave for worlds unknown, what will you leave behind? How will you be remembered? Your bank account? Your property? Your education? Your abilities? Or a beautiful disciple? A beautiful disciple. Revelation 14:13 reads this in closing. I heard the voice from heaven saying, write, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from henceforth. Yea, saith the Spirit, about those that are dead in the Lord. Yea, saith the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their works follow with them. What labors for the cause of God and Christ within this church? What labors are they can be said of you, blessed when you die are the dead? What will be remembered of your labors? Have we labored for Christ? Have we put our time in, fulfilled our offices, done as minimalist, as little as we could, and thought that was sufficient? Maybe poor Dorcas, with her little thread and her little needle, remind us that even the poorest and the weakest can and should be full of good works and alms deeds. And she did it. She did it. And not only does it say that blessed are the dead which die in the Lord, and the works will follow them. Those old widows, when they died, one by one they gained the portals. I wonder what that meeting was on the other side when they entered into the kingdom of heaven, and there was Dorcas. And there was Martha, and there was the other old widow, and yet another and another. One by one they come, and the gladness and the joy. Her works of mercy and beauty had followed her. And now all together. Can that be said of us? Can that be said of us? Not only can it be said, will it be said? Will it be said of us? A beautiful disciple, a beautiful one. Whether old, whether young, whether a youth, a beautiful disciple. Then and only then you have lived As Paul said, for me to live is Christ. That's how those who live for Christ live, as beautiful disciples. Shall we close in prayer? Our Heavenly Father, we pray that in some little way that, though this account written long, long ago, might touch our own hearts and cause us to reason within ourselves of all that you have given to us. What have I done for the Master? And to look back over a life for many of us of long wasted years, acquiring things that are here today and gone tomorrow. What have I done for Christ? What have I done for the kingdom? What have I done for those that are around me, in the family, here at Westminster, in this church, whose needs are great, and what have I done? But not only what have I done, Lord, from this point on, what will I do? The best for my Master. Let me do the best with what time is left. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. You would take your hymnals.